So welcome all of you to the American Society of International Law. For those of you who aren't familiar with AALS, we are a 106-year-old nonprofit that focuses on international education, specifically on international law and relations, and we do everything from high school curriculum development and working with high school students on international issues and introducing them to international topics, to working with judges on the International Court of Justice on developing major judicial and international legal issues of the day, and pretty much everything possible in between. One of the areas that we do enjoy working with a lot is with the international legal academia, and both here and outside of the United States, but we certainly have a great relationship with our faculty members in law schools scattered around the country, and we have an academic partner program where law schools actually become an institutional partner with AALS as well and engage with us on hosting events, holding conferences, speaker series, things that we can do to raise the information and education level of international law among law students and legal practitioners in their area, and also the general public. We do work very hard to make sure that our events are accessible generally to a large group of people, not just those that have received specialized legal training. So this is a rather unique event for us in that it is far more targeted, far more narrowly focused, and is designed primarily for those who are considering going into legal academia, primarily in the field of international law. For those individuals, this is the opportunity to kind of get some sense of what's going on, to ask some questions. We're very proud to co-sponsor this event with the section on international law from AALS, the American Association of Law Schools. And as most of you know, the reason we're doing this now, and tonight specifically, is because this is the faculty hiring conference, or as it's known, the meat market for law professors. So just out of curiosity, how many of you are here specifically for AALS, the hiring conference? How many of you are actually here for that? Okay, a few. That's fine. Those that aren't here specifically for that, we encourage you to find out more about what AALS does, and we're happy to answer any questions you might have. If you're thinking longer term about potentially going into teaching international law, this will obviously still be of relevance to you and should still be useful to you. Our first panelist, who was going to speak first, isn't here yet. Hopefully will arrive shortly. But I do want to introduce Sonia Rowland. Let me pause and where did Christy Ochoa go? Oh, there. Christy is the chair of the section on international law at AALS, and so we're very pleased to co-sponsor with her and thankful for her cooperation and assistance in getting this organized. Sonia Rowland is one of our panelists. She is the co-vice chair of the Teaching International Law Interest Group of the American Society of International Law. And AALS has small groups that you can join that are focused on certain areas. TILIG is one of those, Teaching International Law Interest Group. Fantastic. Good timing, Hyder, as always. Sonia clerked at the International Court of Justice and then worked at Sutherland, Absil, and Brennan in DC before accepting a position at Northeastern, and is currently teaching a whole host of international trade and international law courses there. And so we're very much looking forward to having Sonia's perspective on the kind of experiences that she had breaking into faculty, breaking into teaching in international law. Hyder Al-Amoudi is a very good friend of mine, a colleague of my former location in Pittsburgh. He is a professor of law at the University of Pittsburgh School of Law. He also happens to be chair of their appointments committee this year, so he is the person working with the faculty there to help select new faculty members. Hyder has a wonderful background in international law. He and his lovely wife Sarah, who's also a very good friend, is here. He started off working, well, not started off, but I got to know his beginnings when he was working with EARLI, the International Human Rights Law Institute in Iraq, working on legal education development in Iraq, working with the Jessup team in Iraq and things like that. He has a book out called Howling in Mesopotamia on that. It's fantastic. It's the most non-legal law book you will ever read. The first half of it is about being in Iraq in 2004 and 2005. The second half of it is a love story about how he met his wife. It's fantastic. You should all read it. It's wonderful. But Hyder has been a good friend. He teaches some international courses, but he also teaches Islamic jurisprudence seminar at Pitt Law, and has done a lot of work on Islamic finance and that type of thing, and has a lot of experience working with our center, our Pitt's Center for International Legal Education. I've been on the job for all of 6 weeks. I still think of Pitt as home and AALS is becoming my home, so it's been a nice transition. So the format for tonight is going to be a very brief panel, just half an hour or so, 10 minutes each for the panelists to talk, and then we're going to leave it open for some questions at the end. And then we do want to transition back into the nice reception format and give you a chance to just chat and have an informal perspective of what people are talking about, break down some of those formal barriers and the like. So I will turn it over to Hyder to kick us off from an appointments committee perspective, and then Sonia from a young faculty perspective. Thank you.
You can tell the difference, because when I was first starting, I was at 4 pages. So now it's just talk. Yeah, no, thank you very much for having me, and I'm sorry I came a couple of minutes late, but driving is always unpredictable from Pittsburgh in terms of traffic. I guess I didn't want to take too much of your time in terms of general comments. I did want to, I guess, just sort of talk about or hit a couple of notes about what I thought appointments committees were interested in looking at, not only as chair of my own committee, but through corresponding with other committees, which is a rather common practice these days. What it is that I think is probably important. And I think I would say a couple of things. One of the things is I think that it is rather important to be able to try to tie your international interests, or actually I shouldn't say tie the international interests per se, but to be able to articulate a persuasive reason why you want to do a first-year course that wouldn't necessarily be international, or if not a first-year course, sort of a core course. It doesn't have to be a first-year course. I don't want to overstate it. But what I do want to say is that I do think that increasingly it's becoming important to law schools to be able to justify hiring a position, particularly those of us who are sort of tied to larger universities, to be able to demonstrate that there's a curricular need. Now, those of us on the faculty who actually look at the candidates really just want to find the most interesting candidate who's doing the most interesting scholarly work. And we actually don't really care that much. We figure anybody can teach property, just sort of throw up there. I mean, and not, but anybody within, who meets the qualifications anyway is perfectly smart enough to get up there and teach property. And there are case books and they can figure it out. But clearly, in order to articulate something to the broader university, to the administration, and actually there are faculty members who are older than me, for whom curricular fit with the scholarly project could matter, that articulating a reason, it doesn't necessarily have to be straight within the scholarly project that you're working on, to work on something, or that you would be interested in, say, teaching property or business organizations. If you're doing international corporate work, obviously that's quite easy. But if you're not, if you're doing something like public international law, I think it's just helpful to be able to be prepared to answer a question of, well, I noticed that you were writing a lot in public international law, but you want to teach property. Why is that? To be able to say something to address that. That's probably less true at maybe 10, 15, 20 schools, but I think once, aside from those schools, the importance of being able to articulate curricular fit becomes more important. The other thing I do want to say, and I think this is universally the case, and depressingly so, but American law schools remain, by and large, incredibly parochial by world standards. I mean, the level to which American law professors don't know or understand anything about international law is rather shocking. It's better than it was in the past. It clearly is not what it was, say, in 1970. But you will write about constitutionalism in a country, and you will just get, everything will go back to Dred Scott, as if, right, the entire world is sort of built on the very unique American constitutional project in the American constitutional history. And so I think you have to be prepared for that. And I mean by that, expect questions that seem to not just come out of the blue, but seem to reflect, frankly, from someone who's smart and articulate and able to understand American law quite well, stunningly ignorant questions. And be able to sort of relate your international project in those terms. I don't mean by relate to that, make some sort of facile comparison. That doesn't really impress anybody. but be able to, in one way or another, explain exactly what it is that you're working on and why it's so important, or why it's relevant, notwithstanding the question, or make the question, address the question in a way that doesn't, reveal in some ways its ignorance. I mean, just to give you an example of something that happened to me, I was sort of describing Islamic finance as sort of risk balances and sort of saying, well, they sometimes compare it to labor. And immediately, an employment lawyer said, no, but labor's different because everybody uses employment at will. Everything's employment at will. And outside of the United States, employment at will is kind of controversial. They don't like it, right? The idea of it is kind of offensive, that you can just fire someone for any reason you want to. But it didn't occur to these labor lawyers that that could possibly be the case. So these guys writing about Islamic finance are clearly not thinking about the United States. All of a sudden employment at will was stated. And then you get into a tough situation. You don't want to say, you idiot, employment at will isn't as broadly adopted outside of the United States. But at the same time, it's important to try to get the ideas across. But I do think that this happens a lot. That's just sort of an anecdote that I hope is illustrative. But to be prepared, to try to impress people who really have very little knowledge of American law. That will be the case both on just about any committee, I think, that you meet, and it will certainly be the case during Job Talk when you have the opportunity to meet an entire faculty. I don't think it will be that way outside of the United States, frankly, that level of lack of knowledge. Maybe I'm being overstating my case or being excessively cynical. But those are actually the two real points that I wanted to get across. And I really didn't want to talk too long because I wanted to hear from all of you, or hear from students. Want to see if I could help talk about that.
I'll in part echo a lot of what has just been said. That has certainly been my experience as a candidate, and since then as a faculty member at Northeastern, when we've been hiring, sort of the types of questions and concerns that come up. My colleagues are very enlightened, but still, people do come from different perspectives, and things that we assume as international lawyers to be sort of common ground are not necessarily common ground across the board, and that's something to take into account. So let me backtrack a little bit. I went on the market in the fall of 2007 through the AALS hiring process, and so then I was hired at Northeastern and have been there since 2009. I've been perhaps fortunate to not be on the hiring committee so far. I'm sure it'll come in the future, but still, I've seen sort of the other side of the table as well, and I'm happy to answer questions on that. So the organizers asked me to talk about what I wish I'd known going to the process, and maybe I was singularly misinformed and ignorant about the process, and probably many of you actually know more than I did. So I'll talk about things I wish I'd done more of, and things that made a difference for me, that made the process work. So what do I wish I had known or had paid more attention to? The first item on my list here is believe what my friend said, who had gone through that process recently and who told me much of what has just been said here. And I thought, surely that cannot be right. And it turns out it is. So the specific challenge for internationalists of dealing with a non-internationally minded audience, that cannot be overstated. I think that's critical, and that's why it's so great to have this event organized here for that particular constituency. And of course the challenge comes from the fact that you're supposed to still razzle-dazzle with brilliant scholarly ideas, an audience that doesn't have necessarily the predicate for those brilliant ideas. So you're sort of pulled into two directions. Plus, if there is one international expert on the faculty, you have to impress them, because at the end of the day, the committee is also going to turn to them and say, so do they actually know what they're talking about? And so you're really trying to impress those two ends of the spectrum, and to me that was the hardest part, certainly at the job talk level, but here's the kicker. In the AALS interviews, you might be asked to do a mini job talk, the sort of 2-minute preview. And so that challenge comes up as well very early on in the process. Okay, so that's definitely the first challenge that I was warned about and that I still was insufficiently prepared for. The second thing that I wish I had listened and paid more attention to was the importance of what a lot of people call the wow factor in the job talk, and I still don't know what the wow factor is. But it's this sort of element of, I think the best way I can describe it is intriguing the committee, sparking their interest. Is that a fair way to state it?
Yeah.
Your idea might not be that brilliant at the end of the day, but you've packaged it in a way that kind of makes people pause and say, oh, I hadn't thought about that. That's kind of what you're aiming for. And again, it's tough when you're talking of two different constituencies who are coming from different perspectives and who don't share a common ground. So that's a fairly elusive element. The third element, again, that I have been warned about by many people and that I wasn't sure what to do about is the importance of politics and committee agendas. And the good news here is you can't do anything about it, so you don't really have to worry about it. The bad news is it's still in your way. All right, so I guess my advice here is it's real, and it can play in your favor, and it can also play in your disfavor, and that means that if it doesn't work out, well, it might not be your fault. It might just be that that's not what the schools were looking for, or there were segments of the faculty that loved you. But they were the minority segments, and the other segment and the university provost said, yeah, well, that's great, but we need a common law prof. So that's kind of out of your hands, and so I guess my message here is don't take it personally. It's a tough process, that's the reality of it, and it sometimes gets you down, and in part because there's this element that you just have no control over. So that phase you can't really do much about. So what can you do about? What do you have control over? A few things at the AALS interview stage. Expect a mix of interviews. Some will be more about why do you want to go into teaching? What do you want to teach? Generally, what is your research about? What would you expect your research agenda to be about? Other interviews are going to be much more focused. Hello, please give us your job talk in 5 minutes. I was under the illusion that only the top maybe 5 schools were doing the mini job talk format, and I found that other schools that I hadn't necessarily expected to do that also did it. And so I was not as prepared as I should have been there. So I don't know what the field is like today, but I think that's something to consider. For a lot of schools, though, the AALS interview is a two-way sales pitch. They're trying to market themselves just as much as you're trying to market yourself. So being cognizant of that and aware of it and receptive to it and showing your interest in the particular school is really important. The reality is a lot of committees don't want to be wasting their time and their money bringing people on callbacks who are not really interested in the school. We're just going to use that to leverage the offer for somewhere else, or some people do, and we don't have a real commitment to the school. So how do you express your commitment to the school, your genuine interest in the school? Know about it, know about the school. Can never do enough research. Know about the ethic, the particular educational project of the school. Every school is a little bit different. And trying to figure that out and talking to people who teach there, it might help you to, or graduates, it might help you to get a better sense of the school ethic and ethos. And I think it's important not just to succeed in the interview, but if you do get an offer, to make sure you end up in the right place. Otherwise, your life might be pretty miserable, and then tenure track may not work so well for you if you're actually not a good match for the school. So it's really it's important for both parties involved here. Another thing that comes up in interviews, and that very much goes to the point about teaching, your teaching interest and being able to teach, or having a genuine interest in teaching, or a credible interest in teaching what many people call bread and butter courses, first-year courses and large upper-level courses, corporations, administrative law, etc. internationalists are still often seen as an exotic bird that may be very decorative to have in your school, but can we really afford to have it? And guess what, there's a crisis going on, so maybe the internationalists are not the first priority on the list. So, your job is to make a convincing case that, no, you're not an optional extra. You're actually a necessity. Because guess what? Legal practice, just about any legal practice, really involves international aspects. And that's what you want to teach people rather than some exotic, topic. Your research might be exotic and that's fine. But as far as what you bring to the school for teaching purposes, if you can make a convincing case, I think you'll get the attention of hiring committees. And of course, the counterpart is also a willingness and credibility in teaching those so-called core courses, though why international law is not a core course still is beyond me. But that's kind of the reality in these days. So how do you build that credibility? Think about casebook, syllabi. Have something to say. And that's a question that I've often been asked in interviews. What casebook would you think of using for, you've listed the courses in the questionnaire, right? AALS questionnaire, you've listed courses that you would be interested in teaching, and they will take you up on that. What casebook would you use? What method would you use? Would you do case study? Would you do practice simulations? Now, if you've never taught before, it's really hard to think about that so early on in the process. So I guess my behind-the-scenes tips here would be, well, reflect back to your law school experience. Did you like the casebook? Did you wish you had been taught otherwise? If you've had practitioner experience, have you found gaps in your training? Are there things that you would bring to the classroom? I think committees would generally be interested in hearing that, and it shows that you really thought it through and that you have some value added to bring here. And it's something that faculties in any discipline can relate to and be interested in. So I think that's one way to think about building your credibility. All right, moving on to things, I'll be brief. Things that make a big difference for me, things that you can probably never do enough of. Leverage your alma mater and the law school you went to. Law schools are thrilled when their alumni go on the job market. It's considered prestigious, and they're usually quite eager to support and help those candidates to be prepared for the job market. So go back to your law school, reach out to your professors, reach out to the Dean of Academic Affairs there, find out whether they have programs to help you in this process, to educate you, and ultimately, hopefully, to moot you for your job talk. That is one of the best services that your law school could do for you, and many would probably be eager to do it. I certainly had a lot of support from Michigan in that respect. Some may even be open to inviting you to teach as a visiting assistant professor, which is great because you're visiting from nowhere, but for 1 year to support you as you go on the job market, to give you the teaching credibility. That's what I did at Michigan, and it was tremendously helpful. So especially if you're early on in the process, you're thinking of this medium term, long term, that's something to consider. The private practice experience. There are different schools of thought on that. There's some schools that look at practitioners with some degree of skepticism. They think, oh, you just think academia is easier than a gazillion billable hours, and that's what you're trying to get out of it. And so some schools can be a little skeptical of those candidates. And then there are other schools who think, you know what, we're training attorneys. These are professional schools, and so people with some amount of practice can be really valuable. They could really bring something to the classroom. So that's something to figure out, I think, on a school-by-school basis, how much you talk about your practitioner experience, if you have some. If you are able to talk to your colleagues in private practice, share it with some people that you are going on the job market. There are also some private practice outfits that have connections to academia. People might be teaching as adjuncts and might know some colleagues, might know people in law faculties. That's helpful. So, in as much as you are in the position to share within your current organization that you're going on the job market, there might be some helpful connections here that you can leverage as well. That's, of course, not possible for everyone. The research agenda. Of course, you have to build a credible research agenda that you have enthusiasm about, and that you can relate to your trajectory so far, especially here. I'm thinking of those who come from private practice who maybe had much more limited opportunities to develop research and publications. Think about how you can leverage your practitioner's experience into a more reflective, scholarly perspective that might help to bridge that gap. And finally, to finish on an optimistic note, something that I kept in mind throughout the process and through the tough times in the process, something that some senior person had mentioned as I was initiating this process. This was my first chance, and this is your first chance to meet, for many of you, I don't know, some of you are already teaching, but for many people it's the first chance to meet future colleagues. Regardless of whether you end up, you're going to be working with these people. They might have interviewed you, they might not have hired you, they might hire you 5 years down the road, you might run into conferences run into them at conferences. And if that's the job you want, you should be excited by this opportunity to get to meet your future colleagues. You're my future colleagues, and I'm excited to meet you today. So I actually, it sounded crazy, it sounded daunting to me at the time. I was like, yeah, sure, right? The reality is that I actually did get to develop professional relationships with people I never dreamed I would be in contact with so early in my career as a result of the hiring process, even in places where I didn't get an offer. So that's the upside to take away from the process, and obviously keep in mind to get you through the tough times. So I'll stop here and I'll take questions.
Actually, Wes, do you mind if I stop? Because I thought it was a very, very good set of remarks, and I sort of wanted to add a little.
Go right ahead.
Actually, starting at the end, I think that's absolutely true. I mean, there are definitely people that you have the opportunity now to talk about your work with a whole bunch of faculty members, and many of whom are going to be interested in that. So you absolutely, it is an opportunity to create a first set of impressions with future colleagues. Some of them might not hire you, some of them you might turn down, right? I mean, it can work both ways, but you still have that opportunity to do that. The private practice issue, my inclination is that it's probably better to play it down. And I don't mean that as it's a negative that's going to drag you down. I think most of us think, at least those of us who teach in the private law side, commercial and corporate kind of work, tend to think that private practice is good because you can teach much better. You can explain to the students, you can tell the war story about something that you did. It relates things to them in a much, much better way. But the issue you're always going to have is this sort of bias of, can you think at a theoretical level? Can you write at a theoretical level? Or is this going to be, is your work going to be, bar review kind of stuff? And there's a certain, sort of like publications that you expect practicing lawyers to find benefit from, but not necessarily scholars. And early articles always portray that tendency from junior scholars, but the question is, you convince people that you're sort of moving in the scholarly direction. And I think that the less you talk about your private practice, the better that is. Again, it's not necessarily a drag. I think the positive sides of it people internalize, and the negative sides can be somewhat dangerous. So I tend to think that it's better to play it down. Obviously, if you're asked about it, oh yeah, I kind of worked it. I don't think you want to hide it, but it's obviously there. But that's a certain reality. The research agenda, which is related to that, I completely agree. The only thing I was going to add was you're not really bound by your research agenda in any way, shape, or form. What you want to articulate is that you've got these ideas that you're trying to carry forward. And this is what I'm going to do. And I've got these, and you want to sound like you're bursting with ideas. No one's expecting, right, that 3 years from now. So I don't even remember the research agendas of the people that I interview. I don't know my own research agenda. Well, I kind of do, but they certainly haven't followed it. But no one's expecting you to be held to that. So don't think of it that way. But think of it as an opportunity to sort of, this is what I'm working on. This is what I'm going to work on. The job talk. For us at least, and I think most schools, absolutely, the first question is always, what are you working on? And we want to talk for about 20 to 30 minutes about scholarship. And then there's questions about teaching, of course. And then there's questions from you to us. So I definitely would be prepared for that. And I don't think that's, I agree with you, I don't think that's a top 5 school thing. I think that's a lot of schools do that. I did want to say, when you get to teaching, I think it's a great idea to try to tie things into casebooks. The only thing I wanted to add to that, I didn't want to just agree with things, but what I wanted to add to that is there's a place where you can leverage international experience. You know, I talked about law professors being stunningly ignorant about international law, but at the same time, you are talking about a very smart and extremely intellectually curious group of people. To the extent that you say, well, here's something interesting about property, and here's how it's done, but what I'd really like to do, or say contracts, which I teach, what I'd really like to do is introduce some ideas for the CISG and show how they're related to really civilian ideas in the contract. You're not with a group of people who are going to say, well, that's dumb, right? I mean, they're going to find that interesting, even if they have no idea what you just said, right? And you're going to have an opportunity to expand those ideas more fully in a way that will both be impressive to the international specialist and to the generalist. The 2 last things I really wanted to agree with and sort of expound upon. I completely agree that you have to impress the international specialist to get the job. What I think is useful is knowing the committee that you're before, because the thing is, there may be an international law specialist on there and there may not. And if there's not, they're not going to have time, and they're not going to be interested in calling back to their school and try to figure out what. I mean, you have to know who it is that's on your committee, and to the extent that and sort of try to mold your talk in a way that sort of fits within the people who are on the committee. So I think it's always useful to just get a general sense of their background. Obviously, I don't think it's feasible, depending on how many interviews you have, it's not necessarily feasible to try to figure out everybody's, you know, what every single member of each appointments committee is doing. It's obviously impressive if you could talk about their work to some extent, but I don't think that's as necessary. It's just having a sense of where they are, what they do, you know, how international are they. As you do it. And then the last thing I really wanted to agree on is sparking the interest. The reality is we get a lot of forms, and a bunch of them are completely implausible, and a bunch of them, well, I shouldn't say, but there's some number that are clerked for 3 Supreme Court justices and 7 articles in the Harvard Law Review, and obviously this guy's going to, or this woman, or this man or woman is going to get a lot. But then most people sort of, they're remarkably similar. And what you really want to be able to do is to just sort of just grab someone. I mean, just somehow it just sparks an interest. And it's hard to explain. I think you're right. I mean, it's not the question of you not knowing the wow factor. It's hard to explain why do I hear someone and just think wow. But you've really got to think of it as a sort of a sale. It's not that so many people are doing such interesting work and they're smart and have the degrees and have the background. And so, you know, you just sort of feel like something that can really spark the interest. I mean, I agree on committee politics. As you said, I mean, there's nothing you can really do about it. The only thing that you can really take from that, I think, is, you know, sometimes the talk goes really well, but you don't seem to get a callback, and some other talks don't seem to go so well, and you do get a callback. And you can't figure out why that is until you actually sit in the room on the other side, and then you realize how, you know, things just you know, I mean, you know, you're throwing out a bunch of names, and one's against the other. And it just gets into, I don't say randomness, but it gets into some sort of politics that are really out of your control. It's not that anybody even dislikes you. I mean, it's not a question of, you know, you're in the committee and then someone says, well, I really just didn't like that person. But sometimes that happens. But a lot of times it's just sort of shuffling. I mean, you've got to pick a certain number of people. And then that's how it ends up being limited. The last thing I did want to say, actually, in terms of expressing interest in the school, I think that's important. And I think it's sort of useful. When you're given an opportunity to ask questions of them, it's always useful to ask, you know, questions like, what kind of support do you offer to junior faculty? You know, that's sort of an easy question that can be asked. I mean, how would you describe the faculty? You know, do you work together? Interdisciplinary opportunities, actually, for internationals, I think that's always a good one. What I would shy away from is, you know, question. You don't want that opportunity. You don't want to stand out because of the questions that you ask, because usually that's a bad thing. I mean, usually it's because someone wonders. And so questions, for instance, about the geography. If you've got Manhattan all over your resume, and I lived in New York for 10 years, and all of a sudden, and many of our committee members, or not just our committee, many of the faculty have, and all of a sudden the question becomes, well, you know, what's Pittsburgh like? the immediate reaction, and it sounds innocent, but the immediate reaction is, oh, they don't really want to leave the East Coast. They just want to sit in 4 big cities, and that doesn't, it doesn't seem to work as well. I tend to think that questions that focus on scholarship and questions that, are probably the kind of thing that nobody remembers are the good questions. They express interest and they're sort of safe, and that's not where you wow. You wow on your scholarship, because that's really what we're going to hit first and the hardest, and really want to hear what you're interested in and where you're going to take it and that sort of thing.
All right.
Can I just, like, a couple
Yeah, go,
really
please,
quick things?
please.
These comments are super valuable, just so that you know why I'm commenting rather than asking questions. I'm the chair of the section of international law for the AALS, and I'm also on our appointments committee. I teach at Indiana, and I'll be the chair of our appointments committee starting in January. And so I think that the comments that you got were really, really helpful, and I think I might just add a couple of quick nuances. I think the point about knowing your audience is an extremely important point. Last year we had 2 people here who were our most active and prolific internationalists, and we had a wide open conception of what we were hiring, and that's really important to know, as opposed to, this year you might get a similar impression, but we're not hiring international law, unfortunately, this year. But knowing your audience is really important, because ultimately what you need to do is, I think thinking about this as a sales pitch is crucial. You do have 30 minutes to sell yourself to a committee that wants to impress its own faculty and asks them to come to an hour-long talk to hear you. And if your faculty feels like you have consistently wasted their time, they're going to lose interest in you as a appointments committee member. And that, so if you just think about the fact that everybody's got their own sort of set of interests, including the interests of the school in mind, you do need to make sure that you speak very coherently and tell a good story about your scholarship and about the private practice thing. I think the crucial piece is that if you've worked in private practice and you can tie that to your scholarship and your teaching interests, tell that story, right? That's the reason you were in private practice, so that's what inspired you to go into academia. That's a wonderful story to tell, in fact, because it says you've got some sort of internal inspiration and motivation.
If you tie it to a theoretical project.
Yeah, absolutely,
Yeah,
exactly. Either because it led you to private practice and you knew you were always going to leave,
Sure.
or because something happened there that really made you recognize that there's just a big lacuna that you need to fill.
Sure.
And then I would say also, I think 2 things. One is that when you go back hopefully you'll get campus interviews, right? And there will be people who are going to be on campus who were not in the room in DC. And most likely, the majority of the internationalists on the faculty were not in DC. And you don't know for sure that they're going to have the noon to 1 o'clock hour or the 3 to 4 o'clock hour, whatever the job talk is, free. But you want to make sure you meet them, or at least that you've expressed a sincere interest in meeting them, because they will read your scholarship before the faculty meeting when your candidacy is up for discussion. And if you've made a positive impression on that person, either by reaching out through an email or a phone call or making sure that you spend time with them when you're on campus, that is much more likely to make a positive impression. And I think that is actually crucial, because there's not a school that hires anyone without the specialists in those fields having carefully read the scholarship. And so that, I think, is important. And then the last thing I would say, other than everything, validating really everything that's been said, and this is, I think, tricky, but because on the quality of scholarship and on the quantity of scholarship, because on those sort of measurable factors, so many candidates look similar or comparable or competitive. Ultimately, faculties they recognize that when you hire somebody, you're kind of adopting somebody as a family member. The likelihood that you're going to end up working with somebody for the next 30 years is high. And so you need to also be attentive to the fact that people are thinking about whether you're going to be nice to work with, and whether you have a positive energy, and whether you're going to bring cohesion and, frankly, happiness to the work environment. Because if you seem like somebody who's divisive, I can't tell you how many people we've killed because either we had stories of them being divisive, or we felt like they just didn't have a very positive energy to bring, or seemed overly self-focused, really overly focused on their own scholarship and their own agenda rather than the agenda and mission of the joint mission of the school. And so being attentive to that joint mission of the school and seeming positive, like you've really got energy and good sort of, good stuff to bring is really important. And that part is a sales job. I mean, hopefully it's earnest, but it's really important. Yeah, that's it.
I agree with that.
All right, so questions for, go right ahead.
I wanted to follow up on your references to talking about geography. So I've been through the meeting twice and I've gotten no calls, or at least not here in DC. My problem is I can only work in DC. I have a husband and a family here. I can only work in DC, and I've been very honest and upfront about that. I've put that as a restriction. I have gotten calls from schools who've said, is Philly really too far from DC? I say yes. I get a call, is Malibu too far from DC? And the answer is yes. So I turn them down. I don't waste their time because that's the kind of person I am. And I have a lot of people who tell me that that's really foolish, that I'm the daughter of an academic. My parents ended up in Wisconsin, which is not where they're from, and my mother was never going to be my father. So I know that the idea that is that you go where the job is, and I don't have that flexibility. And some people say, you're being foolish. You might know you can only be in DC, but they don't have to know that. And you don't get that leverage to get the job in DC you want by closing the door on everyone else across the country. So now, having been through this twice and gotten calls that I've turned down, but not gotten calls from anyone in DC, I'm in a tough spot. So do I continue to say that? And how can, if I really have to be in DC, and I do, how can I go around to express to the DC schools that, look, I'm here, I have to be here, so if you're interested in me, I'm serious. I mean, do you take that second avenue as well? What's your advice? Should people be honest about their geographical restrictions?
Well, there's a couple things I'd say. I mean, I don't think you want to string people along too long. I mean, I don't think your instinct is bad on that. I mean, it would annoy, I think, an appointments committee to bring someone back on a job talk, and then, you invest a fair amount of time in them, as they invest time in you, and you to do that. At the first level, there's sort of, would you put it on the FAR form, and then the second question is, would you take the interview? In other words, take the interview. I wouldn't advise you to put on the FAR form a geographic restriction, even if it's there. There were places in the country I wouldn't have wanted to teach, but I don't think it's a good idea, because I think what happens is you give the impression to schools, even within areas that you do want to teach, that you're not really serious about academia, right? There's
I'm
a sort
getting
of
a PhD, so I hope that indicates I'm not serious about it.
they still would take the impression that you might not be serious about wanting an academic job. I mean, I just think that's the conclusion that some people draw. I mean, that's certainly members of our committee have said, and it's in our area, only take a job at Mid-Atlantic or East Coast, and we are Mid-Atlantic, but, well, how serious are they? How much do they really want an academic job? How dedicated are they to it if they're really closing off this much of the country? I mean, that is one of the things. So I wouldn't personally advise you to do that. In terms of the interviews in DC, right, at the AALS, yes, I understand what you're saying. I don't necessarily feel, that it's necessarily that much of a waste of, in other words, they get to interview 24 candidates or so. I mean, they interview a fair number of people, then you get to talk to a fair number of people. Taking some number of those, I don't fill your dance card, but just to sort of get a little bit of practice, I wouldn't necessarily think it was bad. That would be my view. I'd be interested in knowing.
Yeah, also because of the networking,
But I've gotten no call. I've gotten the calls that I've then turned down, so I've not had any interviews.
Right, but you've put the DC thing on your.
Yes. So next time I do, don't put it there. Come do the interviews, get the experience with the networking.
That's what I would suggest you do.
Go ahead.
Quick question about sort of what we call the scholarship paradox. For those of us who are in government work, and slightly sensitive government work at times, I know I personally feel like I have many interesting things to write about. I have my own research plan, but I often find that I can't actually legally write about a lot of the subject matters that I'm most familiar with. So it's sort of a two-part question. One, as a baseline matter, must it be published to have any shot whatsoever? And two, will it seem suspect if you're published on sort of a more generic subject matter than you may have direct experience with it, simply because of the awkwardness of federal employment or sensitive employment at times?
Well, I mean, did you want, I mean, I'm monopolizing the time. Go
Yeah,
ahead.
no, I mean, you're in a better position to answer that one, but I would say, yes, I think having publications on the table at this point is pretty much a prerequisite to have a serious shot. Now, with respect to the restrictions, you know, it's a fair point, right? You want to explain that to the committee, but I would find it hard to believe that you couldn't publish on anything that you've worked on, right? So, yes, you might not be able to explain the US's argument at whatever recent ICJ proceedings, but again, that's kind of not the point of scholarly work, right? Which is going to be pitched at a higher theoretical level, and that hopefully you would be able to do. It wouldn't be captured by the confidentiality restrictions. So I would say almost to the contrary, right? Your ability to rise above the specifics of the work you've been doing, and to discuss more the theoretical implications or the whatever other implications would be seen as powerful if you can do that.
Yeah, I mean, I think, and you had said something similar to this, I mean, that I think is probably true. To the extent that you want to bring in outside practice, government practice, by the way, is, I mean, there's a lot of government people in academia, it's a sort of good thing. I mean, it's a good background experience, but I think you want to try to tie it to a broader theoretical project. Now, if you can do that, and put that into, at least one or two pieces of scholarship, it just sort of puts you in a position where you can then discuss it. I don't think even if they were to try to ask you details at that point, I mean, you could say, of course, that, what I was working on was kind of classified or whatever, but really what I'm interested in, and where scholars, I think, are going to press you is on the broader theoretical thing. I'm going to talk about the erosion of sovereignty on the basis of particular positions, or the very interesting position that the United States has taken with respect to the International Criminal Court, tied to a much broader theoretical project, opposed and supports. I mean, you don't just want to say opposed and support. We all know that, and again, that's not theoretical enough. But if you're really going to try to tie it into sort of something that's at a higher level of theory, I don't think you're going to have as much problem with the whole idea of it being classified. And then I think tying it into stuff that you've done can actually be quite positive. What I was and so I completely agree with you on that. What I was saying, what I think one should shy away from, and you apparently can't even do this, but a lot of private practitioners, will end up coming in and saying, well, and then I worked on, 7 deals where there was, 7 levels of mezzanine debt, and that was really complex. Okay, I mean, no one thinks you're stupid. You wouldn't be here if we did, right? So that's what you want to avoid, like war stories and that sort of thing. We think that's helpful when you talk to students. It's not helpful to get the job.
Other questions?
At what point do you look at references and what kinds of references are helpful and what kinds are not? Say law professor who can speak to your scholarship as opposed to a judge as opposed to a law partner.
I would say exclusively law professor. I don't think I personally would not include anybody else. And when do we look at them? Generally speaking, after this conference. In other words, we usually decide on the job talk thing first. There are times when that's not true. But for the most part, so there are times when we're deciding whether to interview where we might talk to a reference. If we know the reference personally, I have called references prior to this conference and just asked, what someone thinks of their work, because I know the person personally. There are times when you're sort of on the fence and you call. And there are times when you walk down to the, it's about patents, I don't know anything about it, and I just walk across the hall to my colleague and ask him what he thinks of the work, if he gets to spend, a little bit of time doing it. So there are times when you look outside, but I think really when you look the most outside tends to be after the conference. At least that's our experience, I don't know.
Yeah, the only thing I would say is I would not substitute an academic reference for a judge or a partner at a firm where you've worked, but I would add them.
On the FAR form or?
No, on your CV.
Right.
Because once we've decided to bring somebody back, we do really care about what it's like to work with that person, and so it would really matter to us to know what you're like to work with code clerks or with other associates, and then with juniors, with people who work under you. Is really important to us because of the fact that you will eventually become a senior faculty member and you will be supervising students. And so we really care about that.
we may have answered a different question. On the FAR form, I think there's 3 names. Those should all be law
Yeah,
professors.
yes, I agree.
To the extent that we're talking about a CV that has, say, 7 references or 10 references, then I don't think that, I mean, that's absolutely.
I mean, that's it, if you clerk for the Supreme Court, I
Yeah.
don't think that's necessarily going to be, I put my ICJ judge on the FAR form, okay?
Right.
So, you know, I think
Yes, at
it
that
kind
level,
of
but-
depends what your experience is with clerkship. Now, I would just add a little bit on that. Okay, there's the technicality of the FAR form and of the CV, but references are, I think, more than that. They're also presumably people you have a relationship with and who know your work. They are people who can spread the word about you beforehand, right? And throughout the process to share with their colleagues, especially their law professors, that you are a serious candidate, that committees should be looking at you. That's really important. And for those of you who are, I know there's some people who are earlier in the process who are thinking about going on the market a few years later, do keep in touch with those academic contacts and get them to spread the word even earlier on, you know, over the summer and during the fall before, so that you get those AALS interviews in the first place. So I would have, you know, a broader view of the role of references. Yes, there's the question of who you pick to put on the form and so forth. But I think references are can do much more than that for you.
But by the way, that's actually a good reason to have, that's another advantage of having something published ahead of time, because you can go and create a relationship with a professor that you've had, right? And, you know,
Share
here's,
drafts.
yeah, exactly. And then if they come, because if I call a reference and they say they were a really good student, they were really smart, I mean, it's not bad, but okay, right? But if they can say, I've read this piece, and this really shakes the world of something I don't know anything about, that's, I mean, it's much more powerful.
You actually started to answer a question I was going to ask, but if you're outside a PhD or an SJD or any other sort of academic place and you're trying to start writing things for journals and publication, who do you ask to edit and give feedback from?
I would say, again, go back to professors you had a relationship with in law school. You know, if there are any that are relevant to that field, because you build that relationship and they might feel some kind of moral duty to read your work, right? If you know people elsewhere, you know, or even people who are in practice but who teach as adjuncts, you know, if as a sort of, if you don't have full-time professors that you can reach out to and build those contacts. There's also some people who just sort of send scholarship, not out of the blue, but they don't necessarily have a connection directly with the academic. You're foremost in the field and I noticed your work and I'm really working this in response to your work or whatever, that could be a possibility. Another possibility is people you meet at conference that you talk to at conferences, maybe they presented on a panel, you went and talk to them, you explain what they're working on, maybe they'll offer. They'll say, oh, that sounds interesting, why don't you send it to me?
And I'll actually chime in on this one. ASIL is a perfect organization to foster that kind of connection. If you're looking for a chance to meet people in the field of international law, you know, we've got 29 interest groups. They cover any specific topic of international law that you're interested in. They almost all of them have regular meetings, have events. There are almost always academics in that area that are involved in those interest groups. Going to those interest group events, getting involved with them, webinars, panels, conferences, whatever it might be, that's a great way to meet some of these people, get to be known to them as a person. So you're not just emailing them out of the blue, sending them something. You're now the person who helped set up that wonderful, you know, event at your law firm where they got to come and speak, or, you know, did something else where you've proven that you can be trusted, you're valuable. Now they feel a little bit more comfortable engaging with you on a non-event driven level, and you can reach out to them and say, hey, I'm writing something, you know, that conference that I helped set up, you know, it sparked some really great idea that I had, and I'm going to try and put together some kind of piece. Would you be willing to give me some tips, or, you know, look over what I've got for a draft or something like that? So that's where AALS can step in and be a great organization for you to engage with faculty and academia across that practice versus scholarly divide.
And along the same lines too, if you were on a journal, in that field. If you're on the International Journal in your law school and work with authors, again, you have a connection. So you need to ruin their piece and got them really upset. Certainly, I made a lot of relationships from my journal experience, and people I'm still in contact with, and people who actually were tremendously helpful to the process.
I do think academics are the most helpful. I mean, I'm going to stick with the scholarly advice. By the way, it really doesn't matter where you went to law school. I don't know, somehow that question comes up to me a lot. Well, I didn't come from such a great school, and so will you pay attention to a professor from such and such? As if, right? As if that's what we do, like sit around and decide what professor we're going to read on the basis of that. I mean, that's just, so if it's someone in the field, and they've written to me, and they've said you should look at this person, I take that quite seriously. It doesn't, where they went to school is completely irrelevant. And I wouldn't even have said that except for the fact that it keeps coming up to me. It doesn't matter where they went to, where they're teaching. It doesn't. I mean, at least certainly, to me and the members of my community, it certainly doesn't.
So I'm a recent law grad, and I was just curious, how many years of experience do you try to acquire before you put yourself through the market?
I think it really depends on the nature of an experience. I practiced for a year. I actually practiced first with Sutherland and Brennan in DC, and then was offered the clerkship at the ICJ. At that point, I realized I wanted to go to academia, and I just wanted a bit more time to develop more. I already had some publications on the table, but I felt I needed more, so I went and did a PhD. So I graduated in 2003, and I went on the market in 2007. It really depends what you've been doing in the intervening years. If you were out of the law school and did a federal or Supreme Court clerkship, and then did a fellowship in the Legal Fellow at University of Chicago or some other visiting assistant professor, you might be ready in a short amount of time. But I think the core test is how much publications you have on the table and how much scholarship you have.
And just as a follow-up, roughly how many publications did you aim for? I know.
3.
3?
No, I'm kidding.
No, I know it sounds like a very open-ended question because each field is going to be different and all different experience. But is there like a...
Inflation is the word here, unfortunately. That's kind of the reality of things. It used to be, unusual to even have one, and now we're looking at 3. And I mean, when I went, I had 3 big publications, and now I look at the people we're interviewing, and I'm thinking, oh my goodness, I would never get hired. So
it's sort of a mix, right, of where those publications have been placed. If you've got 2 and they both have just been, just slamming the ringer, that's probably enough. And if you've got, 4 and they've been at, decent sort of, special interest journals, that's good too. It's a strange calculus.
yeah.
It's not really just so quantifiable. It's just a bunch of checks. But if you get 2 really good placements, and you're eager, drop. You'll meet people that year, and then you later do better maybe.
Can I just ask about other kinds of publications aside from traditional journal publications? So if it's editorials, if it's things in other kinds of legal or scholarly publications, right? I have a lot of publications that aren't necessarily academic.
My view is that those things can be helpful if you have academic publications, but that you really sort of need the central academic publications. I mean, every place can be different. There's no absolute formula. But I do think that if someone has published in, say, 2 pieces that are impressive, say, places, and then has a series of other let's say editorials or let's say non-academic publications or non-legal publications, I think that sort of, it gives me an impression they like to write, which is a good thing. But the concern that one has if there aren't illegal law journal publications is that, do they like to write on this? Are they capable of writing at a theoretical level? And capable, I don't mean as intellectually, but is this the kind of thing they really engage in? If they can demonstrate that and that they like to write about other stuff, as Wes said, my book isn't even about law. So, I mean, there's nothing wrong with that, but I think that it's,
Right, you need some, but like say 2 journal articles and then a lot of other stuff.
yeah, I mean, two,
Three or
two,
more.
if you've really got some nice, good placements, I think 2 is probably good, especially if you could articulate a research agenda that sort of builds from those 2. I think is, and the problem is it is hard to fix a number, just like it's hard to say how many years out of law school. I mean, if someone comes straight out, you're worried that they're too young and don't really know what they want to do. If they've practiced for a really long time, you're worried that they don't want to, really engage in theoretical work. It's not like, anybody's automatically excluded, but these are sort of the factors, and you sort of have to, and the same thing here. I mean, it's sort of 2, yeah, I mean, depending on where they are, 4, maybe. I mean, so it's hard to, it really depends on the person, but yes, publications help, and the more that you have them. And by the way, if you're here and you say, well, I haven't gotten a publication, you might prove this wrong, great, you might not, in which case, you know what to do for next year. So I don't think of that as a bad thing.
Again, different schools look for different things as well. I mean, if, you know what, if you wrote the founding treaties in your field, and that's on every lawyer's desk, and you're looking at a school that's more into, training people to practice in a particular jurisdiction, hey, they might be quite interested. So, your school might have a very different perspective from a lot of schools that are really aimed more at a local market, and really a practitioner's market.
All right, we're closing in on 8:30, and I do want to give some time for just a little bit of casual interaction afterwards. So we're going to break it up here, switch over to the other big conference room. But thanks both of our panelists for wonderful.